So welcome everyone. Today is our final webinar of our Great Data Cleanup campaign. I hope you have enjoyed this webinar series this summer. So without further ado, we will dive into our final topic this week. And today's short online seminar is on how to cite data. As I mentioned, this is our final session of the Great Data Cleanup campaign. The session is being recorded, and you will receive a notification when the recording and the slides are available to you. If you have questions at any time throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat, and I will take time to answer questions at the end. So I'm Julie Goldman, Research Data Services Librarian at Countway Library, Harvard Medical School. And I offer a lot of these data management training classes, but I'm also available for the Harvard community for consultations on identifying best practices for data management, creating a data management plan, or if you need to find data. And that's where data citations will come into be very useful. So I'm also the co-chair of the Longwood Medical Area Research Data Management Working Group. And this working group includes diverse members from our community, such as the library, information technology, research computing, our research cores, and affiliate hospitals. And we maintain this website that's full of resources and information. So I suggest that you bookmark this website and reference it as you need. So let's review the learning objectives for today's session. We'll understand the role of a data repository in the research lifecycle. You'll be able to identify and build a data citation, and I'll provide some resources and contacts for future help. So today we will really review the benefits of sharing data in repositories and then how to structure a data citation. So as in some of my other research data seminars, I like to show some iteration of the research data or project lifecycle. So having an idea of the overview of the research process can really help us understand the steps and activities that are involved and break them out into more detail. So the diagram on the slide shows how we might work with traditional scholarly resources throughout a project, such as primary sources or collections from the library or databases. And our research project includes elements such as a grant proposal, research questions, our methods, and then collecting data and performing our analysis. And this leads to the publication of reports or journal articles, which are then shared in institutional repositories and available from databases like PubMed, which just enables the cycle to continue. And books and journal articles have long benefited from an infrastructure that makes them easy to cite, a key element in the process of research and academic discourse. However, what about data sets that you may use in your research? You should cite data in the same way that you cite other sources of information, such as those articles and books. So here we can see how research data fits into this research lifecycle like our other scholarly resources. Published data sets can help with our discovery and planning phase. Through our research, we may cite new data sets and use and develop code. And these new outputs, these data sets and code, can also be considered unique research products as well. And therefore, we want to make these available in data repositories in order for others to find and use them, and then ultimately cite them. So we see a key aspect of data management involves not only making articles available, but also the data, code, and materials used to conduct that research. And when we talk about availability, we want to facilitate discovery and long-term accessibility. Therefore, we need some infrastructure to help support this. And that is the role of a data repository. So publishing research data within a trusted repository helps you comply with funder and journal data sharing policies. It supports the discovery of and access to data and can even result in more visibility and higher impact of our research projects. These shared data sets can be cited and referenced by yourself and by other researchers. And repositories offer many other features and services, such as legal aspects and policy for governing the terms of use on data, providing metadata and quality standards to help with standardization and discovery, and ensuring data persists and is in durable formats for the long term. But today we are really focusing on the attribution aspect. First, let's just quickly review the types of repositories that are available for publishing data. I have another webinar that focuses on repositories if you want to dive deeper into this area. But there are three major types of digital data repositories. Institutional repositories are usually connected to the researcher's institution. Disciplinary repositories are discipline specific, and they're often operated by a professional organization, a consortium of researchers, or a similar group. Then open or general repositories allow researchers from different disciplines to deposit and make their data available. And when you are ready to publish a data set, you should ensure that you have reviewed your publisher, journal, or institutional requirements. Some of these entities may stipulate where you need to share your data, especially if it is funded by a particular institute or in a journal with a specific data policy. And then the Repository of Research Data Repositories, or RE3 Data, compares repository functionality. And this is a great catalog, a great place for you to look for a repository, maybe in your domain or subject area if you do not know one. All right, so let's focus on why attribution is important. So if data is considered legitimate, products of research, then we must cite that work. Data citation, like the citation of other evidence and sources, is good research practice and is part of the scholarly ecosystem supporting data reuse. So attribution supports reproducibility, validation of results, and that data reuse. The literature has actually noted that publications linked to publicly available data have been associated with increased citations. And data citation improves the connectivity and provenance tracking of data described in publications, helping researchers find existing resources to use. And we can break out the benefits of proper data citation for you as a data producer and you as a data user. So as a producer, you want credit for your work, and you want to be able to track and measure the impact of your work. And in making data a first-class research product, we can rethink our scholarly contributions beyond research articles. The data sets you produce should be considered on your record as a member of the scientific community. And then data citation benefits you when you are ready to use someone else's data. You can easily find and access that data. And by reusing someone else's data, you are contributing to the research lifecycle and growing your scientific network. Okay, so how do we cite data? Again, we can break down this based on your role in creating or using data sets. So as a data producer, you are creating, collecting, or compiling primary data. And this is when you would determine an appropriate long-term repository for data archiving. So recall the list of different data types of repositories. So for example, your publisher may provide access to a list of acceptable archival repositories, or your discipline or subject area may have a commonly used repository based on the type of data that you are working with. You would then deposit your data into this repository, and you'd receive a citation for your data set from that repository. So when you are utilizing secondary data, you need to cite what you use. When using the data of others, cite both the related peer-reviewed literature and the actual data sets used. You should include formal data citations wherever possible. And these will be provided by the repository or central place the data is shared through. So say you search for some data or use a data citation that will point to where that data is located in that repository. You should be able to access and download that data for reuse. And then you would use the data citation to provide some attribution. And with data citations, you want to be as complete as possible. Don't invent metadata that isn't there. So for example, if a data record does not have a clear author, creator, or title, you shouldn't make one up. You should only cite what you see. So let's dive into the elements of a data citation. So a data citation includes the same components of other citations that we see. Components like the author, title, year of publication, publisher, maybe a version, and an identifier. As a general rule, you want to make sure you include enough information for another to be able to use and locate that data set or the part of the database that you are referring to. So just a side note to say that standards for the citation of data are not uniformly agreed upon and have yet to be codified by the National Information Standards Organization, an organization that sets these technical standards for bibliographic materials. So there are many, quote unquote, correct formats to use. However, several organizations have developed their own practices and international groups are creating formal guidelines for the scientific community. So the example list we see on the slide contains the core elements of data citation from the Force 11 Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles. So we'll use this framework today. So going through each of these components, the author or creator is the creators of the data. This could be one or more people or maybe an organization. And we have the title of the data set. We may have the exact version or edition of the data set that was used. We have a publication date, which is the date when the data set was first published or released. The publisher or the archive may be the data center or repository that is archiving and distributing the data. And then finally, our identifier or locator. Usually this is a URL or other linkable locator for the data. And here we want a persistent permanent URL, such as a DOI or a handle. And we're gonna review some persistent identifiers next. So again, always provide more information than less to help users find the data. In case of a dynamic database that is continually updated, it may be near impossible to refer back to the exact version that you used. In such circumstances, always include a date of download. And in the health sciences, it is common to include an accession number with the database name when you are referring maybe to sequence data. All right, so let's talk about persistent identifiers. This is important because they may vary in the data repositories and databases that you see, and they are very important for always pointing back to the data source. And an identifier is a label which gives a unique name to an entity, a person, a place, or a thing. So unlike URLs, which may break, a persistent identifier reliably points to a digital entity. They are long-lasting, and they usually have two parts. The unique identifier ensures the provenance of a digital resource, and then the location ensures that the identifier resolves to the correct location. So why do we need, or why should we use persistent identifiers? So these persistent identifiers solve the problem of persistence of our cited resource, particularly in the scholarly literature. A large issue with digital content nowadays is things can easily move or even disappear. So link rot is when hyperlinks cease to point to their originally targeted file, web page, or server due to that resource being relocated or becoming just permanently unavailable. So if you've ever gotten a 404 error for a link, this indicates that the content is no longer available at that URL or location. So for citations, we want to avoid using URLs that point to resources on personal websites, and instead use one of these persistent identifiers. Persistent identifiers are also used, kind of in the back end, behind the scenes, to manage our cataloging and describing or providing intellectual control and access to these digital materials. And then a final, another nice feature of PIDs is some provide the discoverability, making our digital items findable and reusable. So there are a few types of these persistent IDs, and you may have heard of ORCID IDs, which are persistent identifiers for researchers. And then DataCite is an organization which assigns DOIs for our data sets. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I mostly included this slide as a reference for you to know that there are different PIDs out there, such as handles, archival resource keys, persistent uniform research locators, universal numerical fingerprints, or UNFs. You'll see these used in Dataverse. But the digital object identifiers, DOIs, are digital identifiers of digital or physical objects designed to persist even if those URLs are replaced with something else. And these are the most common persistent identifiers that you may see for research articles and data sets. So like I just mentioned, DOIs are one of the most used persistent identifiers in the scholarly communication, and they are used across disciplines. And they can be used for almost anything on the web, from articles, book chapters, to data sets and code. And major benefits for using and citing DOIs are that your links don't break, and also the metadata associated with a DOI speaks to such things like Google, Crossref, ORCID, which are all organizations that ensure the discoverability of that item. So let's look at the structure of a DOI. As you can see, it has several parts, a resolver, a prefix, and a suffix. So the beginning part, the https://doi.org, is that DOI resolver. This makes the DOI a actionable URL. Next, the prefix, which is the 10 dot, a certain string of numbers. This is the prefix which is assigned by Crossref, and this is a fixed and standardized number. So the 10 identifies the link as a DOI, followed by this 4-digit number, which applies to the registrant who minted this DOI. And then we have a string of letters and numbers at the end, which is the suffix. And this is decided and assigned by the member. So the registrant defines the suffix, and this can be almost any string. And this provides the flexibility if needed for when, say, migrating existing identifiers to a DOI system. So the prefix and the suffix really make the bulk of the DOI, and then the DOI resolver forms this actionable link. So now that we understand the elements of a data citation, let's build one and review different citation examples. So the order of the information is not necessarily as important as having sufficient information to form a full data set citation. So in most cases, you can follow the style guidelines of the research domain or lab group, data source, or publisher that you're working with. So here's an example of a data citation. Here we have the authors, Johnson et al., the year this data set was published, 2018, the title of the work. And this title is very clear because it actually starts with isotope and chemical data for, the title of the publication that it is tied to. Then we see the place where this data is published or shared, the US Geological Survey. And we have our persistent ID in the form of a DOI. So notice that we don't have all the elements we listed out a few slides ago, but this is a very good example. All right, so we're gonna look at some citations, and I want to see if you all identify the different parts. So for the citation that is pictured on the slide, can you point to the authors of this data set? And feel free to type into the chat to see if you can identify the authors for this citation. Great, so there are 6 authors, on this data set. The first author is Barber, Weber, LeBlanc, Hall, Sutherland, etc. So yeah, great. So we see a list of the authors that are included in this citation. So next for the citation, what is the title? So we're looking for the title of this data set. All right, great. Yeah, I know it's a long one to type out. So yes, it does start with poly and so on. Yeah, exactly. It's a long one. This one isn't as nice as I think as the other one. It doesn't include, like data from, but this is the title of this data set. And notice how this title does include a nice location and actually the years that are included within this data set. All right, so next, who is the distributor? Great, again, in the previous example, we saw this is also from the US Geological Survey. Great. All right, and then for this citation, when was the data set published? All right, so yes, for this, we see a date in 2 places. We're gonna answer another question to look at this more closely. So the first instance is the year when this data set was originally published. So for my next question, is there a version number for this cited data set? So great, yes. We see a version number in the second instance of our date. So first we see the year when the data set was originally published, that 2017. Then with this version number, which is 1.1, this indicates this is not the first version of the data set, but probably the second. And the date here along with this version 1.1, is actually the date when the data set was updated or this version was published. So this date may change in subsequent versions of this file, but that 2017 at the beginning will always be 2017. Great. Let's look at one other example. So for our second example, what type of data is this? Great, yeah. So in this citation, we actually have some additional information that's been added. It actually tells us what kind of data we will expect to open up in this file. So yes, it's complete empty DNA within this format, clusteral W. So just some added information for us to understand what we'll be opening, because that's not actually necessarily implied with the title of this data set. All right, so for our second example here, what is the publication year of this data set? Great, so most of you got it. So again, be careful here. We want to look for the first date in our citation, which is 2013, which is the date that this data set was published. So my next question is, when was this data set downloaded? Great, yeah. So like in our previous example, this citation also has two dates. And again, the first date was for the publication year. And then the second is for when the user downloaded this data, which is 2016, January 4th. And I see a very good question here actually about the 1626, which is actually a really good question. Not 100% sure why there's these extra numbers here. So this is something I may follow up with to look at the citation within this repository. Someone brings up in the chat that this may be the time. That is a very good point. So when looking at a data citation, you also may have to take into consideration where this data was published and look at their standard. So let's quickly move on to our final few questions here. So 2016, yep. And then, I'm asking, where is this data published? Great, so yes, this data is published in the repository Figshare. So like I said, you may want to go back to the repository and see exactly, if they have a standard citation for what information they include in their data citation formats. All right, great. I will quickly wrap up here. And putting this all together, where might you see these citations? So here's an example of the data repository Pangea. which is a repository for the health sciences, and it contains a full bibliographic citation of the item so users can confirm they have located the correct item. So it includes the DOI displayed as URL. It provides a way to access the data. And then in the back end, the DOI is appropriately tagged for the code for the page. So again, a formal data citation allows you to connect your data with your publication. And you may come across articles with these data availability statements. This is also best practice for indicating where you got your supporting evidence from to support your research claims. As I have mentioned, sharing your underlying data is a requirement for funders and journals. So this is a very nice data availability statement pointing to the various locations of the data, including the Sequence Read Archive, Genome Sequence Archive, and a local institute in Beijing. And the citation numbers would then point to the full data citation that we have been exploring in today's session. I'll add this if you are interested in learning more about data citation. This article, A Data Citation Roadmap for Scientific Publishers, goes into even more depth than we did today and helps you understand how your article, your data in a repository, and then the data files can all be tied together. So here is our final checklist of the summer series. This should help you get started with ensuring your data is discoverable, reusable, citable, and also trackable, and help you understand the elements of a data citation. So you can download this checklist at the link provided in the slide. I will also send out the link in a follow-up email. So we'll use this really great graphic to review the webinar takeaways. Remember, acknowledgement of the use of someone else's information or work is a long accepted practice in scholarly communication. This attribution is usually accomplished via a citation when you publish a paper or do a presentation that makes use of someone else's information. You include that in your paper or presentation as a reference to the work that of that other person. So it's important to not only cite the literature consulted, but also any data files that you used, including your own. By providing a citation for your data, you make it easier for others to identify and acknowledge it. Data citation helps promote the reproducibility of research results, allows us to track the usage and impact of data, and it provides a structure by which we recognize and reward data creators. And our good practices in data documentation and citation can contribute to reaching a better standard of our reproducible research. So again, this website is a great resource of all the topics we covered today. You can find all the webinar recordings, submit questions as you start your data management journey. So thank you very much for participating in the Great Data Cleanup campaign this summer. While we did focus on the basics, I hope these webinars have been beneficial for you in improving your work. We really wanted to focus on some principles of data management you could incorporate while working or learning remotely. So remember, data management is the combination of a number of small practices that add up to being able to find and use data when you need it. An incremental approach to improving data management practice is the best. So don't try to implement all the practices we have talked about this summer in one day, 1 week, or even 1 month. Choose one change to adopt at a time and give people enough time to make it that habit. Any changes should be discussed as a group in order to prioritize that implementation. So if you attended 4 or more live sessions this summer, you will receive this certificate. So please look for that please look for this in your inbox in a few days. And then ensure that you look for more webinars this fall. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter to receive announcements. So thank you for joining today. The recording and the slides will be posted on our website. And I would appreciate your feedback on today's session. So please fill out the survey at the link provided on the slide.